One way to think about the way the information environment shapes public opinion is to think about it from a sort of strategic standpoint. Who's sending information and who's receiving information? Okay? When we're talking about who's receiving information, one of the benefits, supposedly, of sort of social networks and interpersonal communications is that you can learn from your family and friends. Right? There's a lot of people who don't find politics to be that interesting, don't want to watch the news, don't want to pay attention, and then perhaps they could subsidize uh, their information search from their family and friends who do like to watch the news, who do find politics interesting. Okay, so it's possible that social communication can be used as a shortcut, and the idea is that the whole electorate could be better than the individual parts, right? So if you have a sort of a citizenry in which a few people know about politics and other people don't, right? If you sort of measure what these people know, it's going to look like that this sort of group of citizens doesn't know that much, right? But if these citizens who don't know that much can talk to their friends who do know a lot about politics and say to them, for example, just, well, how should I vote in this current election or on this ballot proposition or something like that, well, then they can use that information given to them by their more informed people, more informed friends, to make good decisions. The problem with this method is that the people who share information are not like reference librarians. You don't just go to them and say, hey, who should I vote for? And then they sort of evaluate your preferences and they evaluate the candidate positions and say, oh, well, you should vote for this candidate, right? The people who know the most tend to be the people who care the most about politics. They kind of want to, they don't want to just give you information. They want to persuade you sometimes to adopt their positions and to vote for the candidates they like. Okay? They're not going to lie to you necessarily, but they might slant the truth. They might say, for example, that their favorite candidate is more moderate, the other party's candidate is more extreme. Um, and they may not just come out and outright say that, but they may emphasize their candidates' more moderate positions and ignore their candidates' more extreme positions. And they might ignore the other candidates' more moderate positions and just emphasize the other candidates' more extreme positions. This is actually a long time, long notice sort of issue with social communication. Rousseau talked about the best way that we can be governed is if the general will of the people, if we could figure out what that is and just go with what the general will of the people is, the general will being essentially here, what do the people want out of their government? And he wrote that if, when properly informed, the people were to come to its decisions without any communications between its members, the general will would always emerge and the decisions would always be good. So what he's saying there is, if people knew things and then they didn't talk to one another, then whatever decision that body made would make a great decision. And the reason they can't talk to one another is that Rousseau's worried that some people who are more persuasive, some people who have greater power within the community, are more likely to tell people and sway them. Well, you should vote this way, even though I know it's not what you want, right? You should vote with me. And then maybe that person would say, oh, well, maybe I should follow that. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I should follow what this person's saying. They seem to know more than me, or maybe they're just more charming than I am, or maybe they have a position of power. So there are ways in which we can make social communication effective. One of the most important things is to have specific institutions, right? Think about it in a court case. You get charged with perjury for lying to the jury. So you have to tell the truth, or else you could face some consequences. You're not going to have that in sort of an interpersonal situation, but you might have that sort of situation in terms of if you receive penalties, sort of social penalties, right? If you're the person who's constantly telling your friends things about politics and those things are very biased and don't reflect sort of reality, people might start to tune you out about politics, but they might also start to tune you out of other things. They might say, you know what, I really don't like to talk to you because all you do is talk about politics and you talk about it in a very biased sort of manner. What economists would say that you can only trust really the signals coming from someone who has the same sort of opinions that you have, right? So one way to think about this is, let's imagine that you're a Democrat and you have a Democratic friend, okay? What the Democratic friend is going to do if they know more about politics, if they care more about politics, so they're going to read the news and they're going to provide you with information. And it's going to be biased information. They're going to tell you all sorts of good things about the Democrats, but that's actually okay. That's okay to some extent, because if you were to read the information yourself, you would have done the same thing. You would read through the newspaper and you'd see something, and since you're a Democrat, if it said something good about Democrats, you'd be like, well, this must be true. And if it said something good about Republicans, you're like, well, I don't know, that's probably not true. Right? So it's okay if they're biasing the information in the same way that you would bias the information. The problem is if you're a Democrat, and then you have a Republican friend, and your Republican friend sort of goes through the information, and they bias it in a pro-Republican way, well, that doesn't, when they pass on that information to you, that's not what you would have done, okay? They wouldn't, that's just sort of purely biased. Now, one thing you could do, in theory, is talk to somebody who has a pro-Republican standpoint and a pro-Democratic standpoint, and then that way you get information. But what that tends to do is just leave you confused. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to think. But let's imagine we're in a world in which you only have one advisor, right? One person who's giving you information, right? And let's imagine that you are a Democrat, okay? If I told you there was an election tomorrow and didn't tell you anything else but that you're going to choose between a Democratic candidate and a Republican candidate, okay? In that case, you'd probably say, well, I'll vote for the Democratic candidate. Okay? So your ex-ante belief, that is your belief before you have any information, is that you should vote for the Democratic candidate. Now, you talk to your friend, and your friend is a Democrat, and they say, well, you should vote for the Democrat. Okay, you're going to vote for the Democrat, but that's not actually all that helpful information. That's what you were going to do anyway. Let's imagine instead your friend is a Republican, and you say, well, what should I do? And they tell you to vote Republican. Well, there's one of two things you could do. One, you could continue to vote Democratic and say, I'm going to ignore what that person just said. I'm going to ignore what that person just said because they're a Republican. They told me to vote Republican, but that's what they would want. I'm a Democrat. I probably don't want to vote Republican. So you might ignore, and then you would vote for the Democrat. Anyway, so there was no point in listening to that information because you ignored it. In fact, economists would say you should ignore it because it's self-serving. There's no way to know that it's actually a credible signal if they're just sending you a bias signal. Now, alternatively, that Republican friend could say, you know what, based on your beliefs, you should vote for the Democrat. I'm going to vote for the Republican, but you should vote for the Democrat. So in that case, what they're saying is contrary to their preferences. It's not self-serving. Well, now you can believe them, and you should vote Democratic. But again, that's what you were going to do anyway. So there was no point in having this conversation. It didn't make your decision any better. The only way you can improve your decision in this situation, right, is if you have a Democratic friend and the Democratic friend says, you know what, in this election we should vote Republican. That the Democratic candidate, you're a Democrat, and the friend's a Democrat, the Democratic candidate, that's who you would normally support. But in this case, for some reason, maybe there's a scandal involving the candidate, maybe because they have no experience, maybe because the Republican is especially good. That your Democratic friend's saying, you know, I normally vote Democrat, but this time we should vote for the Republican. And now this is useful information to you. It's leaving out, you're gaining stuff that you didn't have before, and you're realizing, oh, if I vote the way I typically vote, in this one instance I'm making a mistake. Right? So when does social communication really help? The advisor, the sender, and the advisee, the receiver, have to have common preferences. They must believe sort of the same things. And that the receiver, what they believe in at first, what's known as their ex-ante beliefs, their ex-ante beliefs are wrong. And then the sender can correct those ex-ante beliefs. Okay? So now the sender says, again, right, so this is a situation. Ex-ante, the receiver believes they should vote for the Democrat, and then their Democratic friend says, no, in this election, we should vote for the Republican. And in that instance, social communication is helpful. In every other situation, it doesn't really matter. You're probably going to ignore the signal, or alternatively, you're going to listen to a signal that there's a good chance it's biased in a way that doesn't benefit you. These professors who used to work at Rutgers, Lau and Redlosk, invented this thing that they called correct voting. And what correct voting is is the idea that you vote for the candidate who best represents your issue positions. Okay, and at least in presidential elections, the candidate who best represents your issue positions is usually the candidate from your party. It's like the candidate from your party over 80% of the time. Okay, so if that's the case, that's one of these situations in which you have these ex ante beliefs, right? And those ex ante beliefs tend to be correct. So if we're talking about voting in a partisan election, you, especially for something like president, you don't need this social communication. All the social communication can do is, or in typical situations, is try to convince you that you're in one of those 20% of situations in which you should vote for the other party's candidate. And of course, if it's only 20% of the time, you're probably not. Often you hear about this thing called like the wisdom of the crowds. And the idea of the wisdom of the crowds is that a group of people, if you take their sort of guesses about something and you average them out, you'll get to essentially about what the true answer is. So one example is if you get a jar of jelly beans and you ask people, well, how many jelly beans are in that jar? Nobody knows, nobody's going to count it, but if you take the guesses of everybody, and you got like 1,000 people guessing, and you took the average of those guesses, you're probably going to get that average is going to be the actual number of beans in the jar, even though most of the guesses are going to be way off. But again, the point with the wisdom of the crowds is the people are not allowed to communicate with one another. Because you don't want a situation in which one person sort of stands up and says, hey, 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 I know how many jelly beans are in that jar, and they may be right, but they may also be way off. And if everyone's sort of like, oh, well, that person knows what they're talking about because they're so loud, and writes down that number, then things are going to get thrown off. The average in a wisdom of the crowd situation has to be independent. Each of those picks, each of those numbers have to be independently determined. Every guess has to be independently determined, right? Now it's just guessing jelly beans. Who really cares about that? But it applies to other situations. It applies to situations like anytime you have a group environment, a hiring committee, a jury, right? If you have one person who's in a position of power or is more charismatic or more persuasive, they can sort of persuade everybody and get people to see things through their eyes rather than independently. So if you think, oh, this large group of people is going to make a better decision, well, that goes out the window once they start talking to one another. If one or two of the people are more forceful and more and more and more persuasive, and in those cases, then the more persuasive and more forceful people, it's their decisions that tend to, or their beliefs that tend to get represented in the decisions that are made, not the average beliefs of the entire group, right? So if we think about what social communication is all about, and we think about it usually as well, more discussion is better, there's plenty of reason to believe actually more discussion can be worse, especially if you have power imbalances, and we do with hierarchical hiring, hierarchical positions in work environments. Oftentimes there's age leads to power imbalances, gender can, and so on and so forth. And so for those reasons, oftentimes the social communication is actually not a good thing. It's kind of a bad thing.